small matter of a rocket test gone wrong with nuclear fallout. And of course, everybody wanted to know what was happening with that. So during all of this time, certainly there was real-time information from both Western and local sources. And I soon learned who I needed to follow on Twitter to find out what was happening. But we also understood we needed to go deeper. And the media will often tell you what, where, and when, but sometimes doesn't go in as deeply to the why and the how. So let me go back to some of what I think are the essential diplomatic skills, and they are traditional ones in some respects. And let me start, I would say, with knowledge, the kind of breadth and depth of knowledge about global and local context. And to any sort of aspiring diplomats out there, I would say never underestimate the importance of understanding the history, the politics, the culture, the traditions, and the myths, and the realities that shape a society and shape others' thinking. Moscow today might look like any other European city, but you don't have to be there too long before you realize that, in fact, there are some very different forces at play. Second point I would say is really about relationships, and diplomacy is all about relationships, and you're only as good as your networks. And you need those networks, you need to build that shared understanding and trust so that you can convey your views to the other side, and that people will trust you to tell you what they're thinking and what might be going on behind the scenes. Really important to create that wide network of partnerships, and especially with those who don't necessarily share your views or objectives. In the case of Moscow, that proved to be a wide range of NGOs, think tanks, business people with different kinds of connections from us, and of course our traditional and non-traditional diplomatic colleagues, so that we could perhaps find ways to partner together on issues, or at least better understand what was happening on the ground. The third thing I would say is timing. Timing is everything, and diplomacy requires patience, extraordinary patience, strategic patience, an instinct to let issues play out and to be ready to step in with the elements of the solution when the time is right. Sometimes you need to move quickly, but often the lasting solutions to complex problems require time and space to build consensus. And then last of all, I would say resilience and creativity need to be in for the long haul. And I think too often we get sort of distracted by the next kind of shiny thing in the window. But often some of the most important issues really require long-term engagement. Willingness to try new approaches, direct diplomacy, finding new partners, leveraging resources, thinking about engaging civil society, and finding out what the other side needs in order to move forward. If I can, like a couple of minutes, yeah? Just a couple of trends that I see that I think are quite important for diplomacy. First one is youth, something politicians are not very well equipped to understand, and probably most of us sitting here on the panel as well. But it's clear that youth are far more engaged than in the past and are shaping events. I think with Moscow, where the protesters were largely young, Hong Kong, and of course the climate marches that we see today. And civil society is key to democracy, and I believe it's a really, really important part of that. Second element I would say is the strong desire of middle class everywhere, really, for freedom of speech, rule of law, participatory democracy. Too often autocrats, I think they can kind of buy the population off with consumerism. Sometimes that works for a while, but I think eventually most countries where you have an emerging or a strong middle class see those other elements as key for their long-term prosperity. Social media, powerful tool for sure for raising awareness and advocacy, especially in authoritarian societies. Invaluable this summer in Moscow in some ways, in terms of focusing on exposing human rights abuses. But it can also be impressionistic, self-centered, biased, and belligerent. And it's not very useful for addressing complex issues like energy, environment, health, cyber, and too often I think focuses on the problem, but not really on the solutions. You asked about whether we were nimble.
Yeah, I didn't ask you that. I was going to ask you that. Are we ready? I mean, as you see it today, you've been in the field in Moscow, and you were away for 5 years. Has anything happened? Has anything changed in that 5 years that really struck you?
Well, I would say, as always, we have some wonderful, talented people in the field doing extraordinarily difficult and sometimes dangerous work. And I think the level of the complexity has changed in some respects. It's certainly faster. Looking over the sort of the past year or so, I see 3 examples where I think Canada has been particularly nimble. The instance when we brought the white helmets out of Syria, the group engaged in volunteer search and rescue, a brilliant operation led by Canadian diplomats, young Canadian diplomats who were, I think, behind much of the work on that. And then partnering with a range of partners, the US, the UK, Israel, Jordan, to pull this off. So really brilliant piece of diplomacy in my mind. The whole reaction to the refugee crisis, also an important piece of diplomacy where I think Canada was nimble, moving our immigration officers out into the field rather than waiting for refugees to come to us. And then the third one is the renegotiation of the US-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which I think required building all kinds of strategic partnerships, both in Canada, in the US, and in Mexico. Lots of work behind the scenes, and ultimately, a successful outcome, which really, if you've been using a lot of social media and broadcasting some of the messaging around that while it was going on, would not have been successful. So, real old school diplomacy at its best, but operating in a very different way.
This actually leads into a question that I have for Mark, because Mark, you were our ambassador to France and Spain and Chile. You've had a variety of other positions at high levels, and Jill mentioned a number of things that have happened, successful diplomatic efforts that have happened recently. But we don't want to get too political here, but when the new government came in a few years ago, it was the talk was that we were going to be back into the world after perhaps a period of contraction. When you look at the scene from your perspective, do you feel that Canada's back today?
Let me give you a diplomatic answer. We are moving, but we're not back yet. We are moving in the right direction on all kinds of fronts. Because when a new government comes in, they have to face their main priorities. And the main priority of the government in foreign policy remains threefold. The first one, a prime minister or government will look at was, how is my relationship with the United States of America? How is it? Is it properly managed? Should we go deeper? Should retract from that relationship? What will be the consequences? It is always the first consideration. And on that score, I will give full marks, as Jill just explained, to the government. Not only are we back, and it was easy to be back when President Obama was running the administration. With President Trump, it is mind-boggling. Therefore, you don't know where you stand, and you don't know what he's going to do, and how much damage he's going to do. And the role of the embassy in Washington and the role of the diplomat is to prevent that damage to the country. on all scores, but the first one, the most obvious one, is on the economic front. You know, if you tear down a trade agreement that was a successful tool for the Canadian prosperity in the last 30 years, therefore you have a challenge. You have an immediate challenge. And therefore, the government did well. We always said, you know, I was in the Foreign Service for 42 years, and I started in 1971 when Trudeau Père was the Prime Minister. And one of my first tasks as a young officer was to deal with the so-called third option. How do we reduce our vulnerability vis-à-vis the United States? Long history, especially for the students here, but you know, one of the biggest shocks was the Nixon, the so-called Nixon measures of August 15, 1971, when Canada was hit brutally in its economy by the Nixon measures. Therefore, the government at the time, from 71, 72, 73, reflected about the relationship with the United States and concluded that we need counterweights. We need to reduce our vulnerability vis-à-vis the United States and have counterweights. Well, the counterweights arrived 3 years ago when we concluded the comprehensive agreement with Europe and the European Union. 500 million people, the largest economic bloc in the world, 28 countries, the most innovative and creative agreement that we have signed, and therefore a counterweight arrived with this government, and I would say a plus. And then Asia. Asia is the region of the world that needed for Canada to have a strategic framework to better work and operate and defend and promote your interests in Asia. And after all kinds of, you know, tergiversations of all type, you know, finally the government agreed to embark on the TPP, and therefore another counterweight to our dependence with the United States is the growing relationship with Asia, and I will say, I will give a plus. In the middle of that, the government, when the government said, we want to be back, we're going to be back, well, in order to be back, you have to invest. And you have to invest in your diplomatic tools. And if you're not prepared to invest in your diplomatic tools, well, you know, it's nice rhetoric, but it is not a convincing rhetoric. It took us a long time to say yes, to send some peacekeeper to Mali. It took us a long time to re-embark on the multilateral front. And we considered a little bit too superficially the challenge of India and China. And now we are confronted with a huge problem with China, and it is not easy to find a solution. Therefore, is the government, I would say partially yes, on the big ticket item, and a long road to recover our dynamism, our world presence, and the place that Canada should assume in world affairs.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I'm going to skip over to Patrick, because we've heard from Jill about the importance of history, and we've heard from Mark also about Canada's role in the world and where we're going. And we've also heard about the 24/7 news cycle. And of course, Patrick, you were part of that news cycle as well. And I wanted to ask you, and it's not in the script per se, but how do you look at the world yourself today compared to when you were in the field in so many locations? Are we better off than we were, or are things just the same as always? Well, we get a seat on the UN Security Council after all this.
That wasn't in the script.
That was.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm usually on panels with journalists and academics and other kinds of experts, and it's kind of daunting to be outnumbered by people who actually know what they're talking about from the inside. But luckily, television journalists have one key skill, which is to appear to know what you're talking about. So I'll deploy that. Are we better off? I think incontrovertibly we're better off. I mean, I think by most statistics around the world, child mortality and diseases and things like that, for all the miserable and outrageous things that happen every day on your iPhone, I think things for more people are better. I think the internet is absolutely fabulous. I really do, and I think it's had an overall net beneficial effect on just about everything from booking a taxi to traveling to the other side of the world in half a day. I mean, these things are remarkable, and the problems that we have with the internet, the problems we have with media, social media, the problems we have with the way our democracies have been kind of subverted by all of this, I think are still outweighed. I hate to sound optimistic because it's not my natural mode, but overall I think if you want a summary of are things better, I would say yes, they are. Are we doing enough to make sure that the darker side of all this doesn't overtake us? I don't think we're doing enough to make sure it doesn't. I look at it with absolute horror. Just the things that are happening in Washington today and London yesterday, and the reason those are happening are to do with the perversion of politics by this 24-hour fire hose of disinformation, and actual information that we're all subjected to constantly. And I think part of that, if we're looking at it from the point of view of diplomacy, I think that perhaps the masters of the diplomats sitting in their capitals saying, well, what do we need these guys for? We're getting enormous amounts of information every second from Ulaanbaatar. But precisely what you need to understand all that from a journalism point of view, I'm very careful what I read and trust. I need to curate this information that's coming in. And if you don't have diplomats out there not telling you what's happening in school today, sure, we know which way the Congress has decided something. We know that there was an explosion in Moscow. We know that the students are back on the streets in Hong Kong. It's not a question of this is what happened in school today. It's what does this mean? And I think that diplomacy has a key role to play in that. And I think rather like looking at the United Nations, there are so many things to complain about looking at the United Nations, but why not start by imagining what the world would be like without it? And I think the same goes for diplomacy. What would our country and the rest of the world be like if our political leaders and people who make decisions in Canada were not informed and guided by what diplomats are saying? As far as judging whether diplomacy is better than it was or worse than it was, I don't really feel equipped. But one of the things is that if diplomats are doing their jobs right, one of the things they have to do is keep people from me not knowing what they're doing and how they're doing it. the time, because the fact that it might appear on the front page of the Globe and Mail or on the National on television tonight might well make it impossible to achieve whatever it is you're trying to achieve. So I didn't very often know what was going on. I didn't feel it was my job particularly to follow every in and out of the diplomatic community. The country I was in the longest, almost 20 years, actually, I think 17 years of living in China and 25 years of covering it as a journalist. That's the country where I most see the day-to-day work of the diplomats. Otherwise, I would tend to be jumped into somewhere for a couple of weeks when there was a crisis going on. And you would see how an embassy would handle a crisis, but you wouldn't know about all the stuff that actually makes the wheels go around. I do think, looking back over all of the ambassadors that I've met in dozens and dozens of countries and embassies that I've had to interact with, it's, I think, almost without exception, worked better when there were professional diplomats doing it than it has when there are patronage appointments or political buddies of the Prime Minister or people who apparently are uniquely qualified because they have business jobs. I think diplomacy is a profession that works better when you don't appoint people to it who are essentially amateurs in that profession. And I don't think there's anybody who's going to argue against that on this one. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And it's perfect because you're leading into, of course, a question for Pam about diplomats and the professionals, the non-professionals, the political folks and business folks that get put into diplomatic positions at high levels. So looking at all of this and everything we've heard here, what's your take on the diplomat of today?
Oh, a nice general question. I like the general question. Yes.
How about you switch?
Oh, okay. There. Thank you. So I represent, we have a panel of a couple of ambassadors here, and at PASO, I represent the officer level, the worker bees of the Foreign Service. So my last assignment was as the head of the political section, effectively deputy head of mission in Warsaw, Poland. And I've had other assignments at that level. I was a deputy director in my last assignment at headquarters before I left to become the full-time president of PASO. So we look at things sometimes, we share a lot of perspectives, but sometimes we have a slightly different angle on things from the trenches sometimes. And it's interesting how there are things in common and sometimes there are things that are different. I mean, from our point of view at the officer level, there is now we figure about 17 to 18% of FS positions are filled by non-FS. So the people who from other categories like ECs, economists, policy analysts, PMs, program managers, COs on the trade side. And we don't think that there should be no other people in FS jobs. I mean, we recognize that, from time to time there's specialized expertise, that there is, sometimes there are jobs that are hard to fill. All of those reasons, I mean, we do see a role for people from other categories, but we think it should be more in the order of about 5%, rather than what it is. I mean, we think that it's too high. And the reason for that is, in some cases, I think some of the bigger picture things like this erosion of the idea that diplomacy is in and of itself a skill. I mean, when you talk to people from other categories, from other government departments, they tend to see themselves as specialists, and they see us as generalists. And so they think that, they can do our job sometimes even better than we can, because they will bring this specialized aspect, whereas, especially as a political officer, sometimes I used to get frustrated because I feel like everybody would say, well, everybody reads the newspaper, so, everyone watches the news, so everyone understands politics and everyone could do our job. And, one of my roles as the full-time president now of PASO is to rebuild this idea that diplomacy is a skill and a profession in and of itself. And that rotationality is a skill. you know, and a capacity that not everybody has. I mean, not everybody can move around from country to country every 2 to 4 years and uproot themselves and their families and their kids and, you know, live and work in a different language and live and work in a different legal system and all of these things. I mean, plenty of people can do that once, but how many people can do that 6 times in 25 years? It does require a special set of skills. On the question of the heads of mission assignments, I mean, we also agree that, you know, Patrick sort of touched on it, but, you know, my line that I use often is, in every profession, there is, you know, the sense that the best qualification for a senior level assignment is a series of progressively more responsible jobs at lower levels. Why on earth is that such a hard sell in diplomacy? You know, after the stuff came up in China and the, you know, then ambassador was, you know, it was in the news, a reporter asked me what we thought of that, and I said, well, I'm not going to comment on anybody specifically, because, I mean, certainly somebody who's been a minister, you know, you can't argue that that person doesn't have some skills that would lend them, you know, that make them qualified in some aspects for certain things. But it's much easier to learn certain lessons about, you know, the difference between establishing a rapport with someone and having a friendly relationship and so on, and you know, really being able to trust someone at the junior level, you know, rather than when you're at the top in such a high profile position. So our position is that, you know, really when possible and unless there is some other reason, you know, you need to think through these assignments, and you also, if you're going to have political appointees, you need to think about the resources that are needed to support them. You know, so you need sometimes you might need an extra position, an extra deputy, or people who can support people and fill in some of those gaps. Because they often bring other skills to the table, other connections, things like that, but not necessarily those, you know, that history of diplomatic work.
Thank you for that. And while we're on the subject of our professional diplomats in the field, Jill, I'd like to turn to you and talk about our diversity balance in the diplomatic world. Because in 2018, we know that Open Canada said we still have a long way to go. And I know this is an important topic for you.
Well, let me start by saying how important I think it is that the Foreign Service be representative of the country that it represents. It's important in terms of equity. It's important in terms of the skills and experiences that it brings to the Foreign Service. But it's also important because it's the face that we show to the world. And when we send people abroad who represent the full spectrum of Canadian diversity, that is a message in and of itself to others about the values that are important for our society and the kind of skills I think that Canada has to offer. In terms of, you know, what's the progress, I guess, that's been made or not made in Canada's Foreign Service, I have been out of the picture for a little bit, so I hesitate to comment on sort of the day-to-day operations there. Certainly, the Foreign Service looks very different from when I joined, both in terms of ethnic diversity and gender diversity, and that's a positive thing, and I think there's room to do more, and I hope that work is underway to make that happen. What I would say is that I think that it's not just about a focus on numbers, it's really about changing the culture so that people feel welcome and able to express diverse views within an organization. And that really starts at the top. It's all about leadership, about ensuring that you create an environment where people do feel able to contribute. I have to say personally, I had a very positive experience in the department, and everybody has, you know, the stories they can tell about, you know, fossils and attitudes and so on. But overall, I found it. I had a very rewarding career with supportive colleagues and fine mentors. But I think on the other hand, I would say I also, became quite accustomed to the culture. And I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a reality. And I know that the culture is changing, and it has changed, and it should continue to change to be more reflective of different attitudes and approaches. I'll leave it there.
And just on that note, Pam, coming back to you briefly, are you finding it, or is it becoming more and more difficult to get people to go overseas today?
Wow, now I have a choice. Excellent. It's hard to say. You know, I think that there always is a constituency of people who really want to go out for their first posting. You know, that's where the bottleneck seems to be, and there are people who feel like they're waiting a long time to get that first assignment. What happens though is, you know, when Global Affairs hasn't done a proper recruitment in 7 or 8 years, you know, depending how you look at the last one, if you think that that was a proper one. And the requirements, the qualifications for people keep going up and up. So, you know, most people have a master's degree now, whereas when I started back in 1993, I think half or slightly less than half of us had a graduate degree. The average age of a recruit in the last round was 37. You know, people were also required to have overseas experience already. And, you know, requiring all of these things increases the age of the people who are joining. So, you know, I was 27 when I joined, and if I had been making some of those decisions 10 years later, I don't know that I would have found it so easy. So there are those kinds of demographic issues. We also find that more and more of our posts are high hardship levels, and things are happening that, you know, people are facing difficulties there that we did not really anticipate 20 years ago. I mean, I never ever thought I would be in Afghanistan, not just once, but twice. And since I did that, you know, there have been many, many other people deployed there into missions in Mali and Haiti. You know, the world is in some ways getting to be a more dangerous place in the places where diplomats and foreign service officers are needed. So, you know, that affects who can take those jobs, right? Because some of them, you simply can't take a family or a spouse with you. And if people then have to decide if they're going to be separated from their partners, it's a difficult decision. We've also been finding things like even posts that were considered, you know, very safe and sleepy, like Havana. I mean, Havana was a family post. It was, you know, it was interesting, but really, you know, very secure as far as living there. And, you know, we had the recent incidents with diplomats, you know, facing severe medical issues from an unknown source. So, you know, I hear from people in Paris, they tell me that they have not been able to, you know, to go out for, you know, 8, 10 weekends in a row because of riots and unrest in Paris. I hear from people in missions in the US that they're worried about school shootings and, you know, about demonstrations and riots and all those kinds of things. So, you know, all of these things are making the idea of a career in the foreign service, I think, maybe a little bit less glamorous for certain types of people. But then luckily there's always the other type of person, which is more like me, that, you know, wanted to do the hard stuff. So hopefully we will still be able to attract those people. But it's my job at PASO to make sure that those people, when they go out, are appropriately supported and protected in what they're doing for Canada.
I'm going to just go to the bigger picture, back to the bigger picture again, and that's talking about the UN Security Council and the fact that we're in contention with Norway and Ireland for the seat on the Security Council. We haven't had a seat in some 19 years. And the question is, do we deserve it? I mean, do we deserve it when we know our foreign aid budget really hasn't moved very much? Our military is more focused on NATO missions, and we have very few peacekeepers in the field right now. Now that the Mali mission is over, probably no more than 30 or 40 Blue Berets currently deployed around the world. It's a far cry from where we were once before. So the question is, to all of the panelists, and I'll start with you, Mark, because we spoke about this kind of being back. Do you think we've done the right things to have a seat on the UN Security Council? Is it important that we're on the UN Security Council, even if for just 2 years?
Let me start with your second part of your question. Yes, it is important because the big ticket items are discussed and tackled at the Security Council. Therefore, the question of war and peace, of tension, of injustice in the world, and more questions such as, should we bring climate change issues at the Security Council level, not only the question of peace, but social issues, climatic issues, economic issues. How do you trigger a better economic development in some poor countries? Therefore, why do you discuss it? Well, you could discuss it in all kinds of forums, but no forum is better place to address those issues than the UN Security Council. It's a problem because we are part of a club. Every region of the world sit on the Security Council on a rotation basis, and we are always compete with our friends and like-minded countries for a seat. Therefore, we are competing with Norway and Ireland, and for the vote of 193 countries, including our vote, that is going to happen. When I look at Ireland and Norway, and us, we are all, well, let's say we're not superpower, we're not, rogue states, we are just great contributors to the multilateral system in one way or another. The Norwegians are just first class, but they are extremely targeted. They are targeted in terms of conflict resolution. The Norwegians are just top of the class. The Irish, well, the Irish is a pacifist country and a neutral country, but they're part of the big club. They have achieved a tremendous transformation in their country in the last 20 years and more since the financial crisis. Oh, it's a great country. And us, well, we're not a superpower, but we are a super country. We are just a fabulous country. We are part of the G7, we are part of the G20, we are a member of the Commonwealth, we are an active member of La Francophonie, we are a useful member of the OAS, and we play an active role on the Venezuela question as we speak. Therefore, we have our place there. At every 10 years, you go but we're going to compete. One thing will make the difference if we're going to win or not is the involvement of our political level. The fact that the Prime Minister and all the Foreign Minister were at the UN General Assembly that opened on Monday is a great plus for Ireland and Norway, because they were there en masse at the political level, chit-chatting everybody, because everybody is in New York during that period. The vote is going to take place in June, but you have to lobby, you need a year or two to lobby. And once we get out of our election cycle, well, I would advise strongly the governments and the new Prime Minister or the re-elected Prime Minister to get going on it if he wants the seat badly. Last time, I can tell you, we lost. Not by much. Again, two great friends also, Portugal and Germany. But the Prime Minister, it was not in his DNA to get engaged and to get involved. And personal diplomacy is irreplaceable when you are looking for something on the international stage. You need to engage your prime minister, foreign ministers, trade ministers. You have to make sure that everybody is lined up with one objective. For the government, after October 21st, has this possibility to not only to realign, because I think that all the series of objectives are, rather moderate objective that we put forward. I mean, nobody could disagree with that, and it's just fine. But it's the will combined with an expression of a vision of what Canada could contribute to the betterment of world affairs in the next 2 years. Not an easy task, but a doable.
Jill, would you like to comment?
I don't know what there is to add to all of that, but I would say that I agree with Malcolm on all of it, in fact, but in particular, if there's an advantage that I think Canada would bring, it is that we have a global perspective. Both Ireland and Norway are fine candidates and would make a fine contribution to any organization, and they are engaged in different ways. But I would say that although Norway does undertake a lot of this kind of conflict resolution, they are largely a regional actor, and Ireland the same. Whereas I think Canada does have this global perspective. We are an power of the Asia Pacific. We are certainly very much part of the Americas. We have long-standing ties to Europe, and I think historical engagement in Africa through originally missionaries and development assistance, and through our membership in the Francophone Commonwealth. And I do think we bring up that very global perspective that the others don't offer. The other, I think, advantage or attribute that we would bring goes back to the question of diversity. And in terms of diversity in a country that is multi-ethnic, multilingual, and has largely built a model in which people can live their diversity in a respectful environment. I think Canada is far ahead of almost any other nation. Not that we don't have our faults and that there isn't room for improvement, but I think it's a pretty attractive model, and I think for many countries that should be, if they're thinking about the values aspect of a Security Council of Action, that should be something we should try to draw on.
Thank you for that, Patrick. I know you were pro-UN in some of the comments you made, and I was wondering from your perspective how you feel about us getting back into the Security Council.
I think it would be quite nice if we had a consistent and coherent approach to the big picture items. Mark was talking about like-minded countries, and there's an awful lot of upset on the international stage because of two extremely large countries. That one, the United States, is sort of in this ridiculous political cock and we don't know how it would go or what it would do from one moment to the next. But then China makes a very studied and careful effort to pervert the course of justice in international affairs and overturn, or sort of bend these institutions to its own way of seeing things. I think these like-minded countries, each pursuing its own little agenda, are maybe not doing as much as they could to sort of try to preserve and promote the human rights values and the sort of general approach to making societies better that we all share, but somehow we don't apply the amount of collective will to it that we possibly could. And if Canada had that desire, a seat in the Security Council would help to sort of cement an effort in that direction. Rather, and we're missing, just in the last couple of years, the international community has missed two very strong candidates for the use of the word genocide. One in Burma, Myanmar, with the Rohingya, the other happening in China right now in Xinjiang with the Uyghur people. And the silence and the willingness to accept these things because it might upset these big players is outrageous.
I find too that we underestimate ourselves on the world stage. We forget that we have the 10th largest economy. We forget that we spend billions in foreign aid. And we're a top defense spender as well. And for me, Mali was a great example because we put our military peacekeepers into that operation. And it was a big deal. It was dangerous. It was frightening. But at the same time, a lot of the gold mines in Mali are run by Canadian companies. We have our diplomats on the ground. We have a long association with Quebec universities working in Mali. All of this going on every single day. I say that we tend to underestimate ourselves. But just to conclude the panel portion here tonight, Pam, I'll start with you. What do you think the biggest challenge now facing us going forward in the diplomatic world is going to be?
I do think that it is maintaining that idea of a professional foreign service, because I think that, as everybody is yelling at each other and you see, the Trumps of the world on the international stage, just the idea that, there is value in trying to speak to the other and in maintaining a group of people who have the skills and capacity to do that. I think it's under threat. We just did a strategic review for PASO. It's the first one in our 54-year history. And when I was going through some of my things, I found that, we've been talking about some of these questions for a very long time. I found papers that have been written, by colleagues that some of these folks would know, back in 2001. And people were sounding the bell then saying, we really need to do something about this. And the situation is only getting worse. So I'm really glad to be at panels like this and see so many people interested in the discussion. Because I think it's something that we're going to be looking to the public and people out there to say, hey, this is valuable and we need to, it's worth putting some resources and some effort into.
Thank you. And Jill, going forward?
I think that one of the greatest risks for Canada is that the institutions that we have depended upon so greatly are really under such stress. And whether it's the UN or the G7, they're institutions that have been critical to Canada's influence in the world, and they're just not entirely fit for purpose anymore. And as the international community writ large continues to struggle with how to reshape those institutions into something that would be perhaps more viable. But for Canada, I think this is a greater risk than for others. I would also say we're operating in an environment where compromise has become a bit of a dirty word, and liberal internationalism, democracy is under threat, and that makes it particularly challenging for us to make our voice heard on all of these important issues.
Patrick, going forward?
The carpenter sees the solution to everything as a hammer, and somebody who spent a lifetime in China sees the problem of everything being China. But I think that is the biggest challenge for Canadian diplomacy, to how to cope with this giant. And I think one of the problems of this, and it goes back to KTN, continued with Harper, and it continues to this day, is the belief that somehow trade trumps everything. And that if only we're just doing more business with China, China is suddenly going to turn one day into a democracy and the rule of law, and we're all going to live happily ever after, and that just isn't the case. And here we are right now with a second problem with an ambassador to be, in that the new nominee has a history of working with a company that has extremely distasteful contacts in China, in Xinjiang, where the Uyghur people are under threat, and in the South China Sea, where one of his clients has been building these islands for military purposes. And his wife is sort of hedge fund manager with deep interest in China. And somehow, because he has business skills, he's the guy that we need to have in China. You need a more nuanced, a more broad, a more comprehensive approach to how do we deal with this, and how do we not become a hostage to this trade relationship, where our citizens are actually being kidnapped to put pressure on us because of a legal problem that I think is too complex to go in here. But really, that it's difficult dealing with the current administration in the United States, but it's going to be gone in 2 years or 6 years, or changed at least. Whether it changes for the better, we don't know. China has no immediate prospect of change. We're not dealing with it with the subtlety and deftness that we need to apply in this asymmetrical relationship.
Thank you. Mark, I'll last word to you.
Patrick, I fully agree with you. The rise of China and what China is doing is a major challenge for a country like Canada, for us. And I really feel that we are not properly equipped to develop a strategic approach to it. We are not doing it or striving towards it, and that is a concern. But it is the reason also that you see a decline in world institutions that have been built in the last 70 years. In the last 70 years, since the end of the Second World War, it is the Western world that built those institutions to serve basically the Western world. And the Western world progress and prosper under those rules. And the arrival of emerging economies entering that prosperity is unstabilizing and unbalancing the world order. And therefore, for Canada, as the major challenge so far, I mean, 21st century is so long, but in addition to climate change, it is how to re-engineer the world institutions, military, economic, social, multilateral institutions that could better correspond to the interests of the emerging economies. Brazil is unhappy, India is unhappy, China is unhappy, and then they are huge powers, and they have done tremendously well in the last 25 years. And now you have a reaction in the Western world. And what is the reaction? Well, you know, Trump is to say we lost all of our jobs because the Chinese had not respected the rules. And then, the British are saying we want out of the European Union because too many rules impose on us and our sovereignty and so on. At one point, and it's coming faster than we think, and it would be for the young generation right there to pick up that challenge, we will have to sit down and say, hey guys, how do we re-engineer our world institutions? Because we're not going to be winners. The other side is going to win. And when I look at our campaign on the Security Council, I have one fear, is potential activism of China against us. They have more clout in Latin America, more clout in Africa, more clout in Europe than we do. And if they decide that we are going to be a troublemaker of the UN Security Council for their own interests, they are not going to give us a free ride. That was my last.
Thank you. Before we go into Q&A, I'd just like to give our panel a big round of applause. I see Gary has his hand up already, and Gary will bring you a microphone, so just stand by. Stephanie is handling our microphone tonight.
I was in Australia visiting my sister a couple of years ago, and in the morning, the Australians put out their foreign policy. In the afternoon, logically, they put out their defense policy. I'm not sure that it's unfolding the way they'd hoped, at least on the foreign policy side. The question I have, I guess, is, have we got a foreign policy? Do we need a foreign policy, or are we going to have to be just quick-footed?
Who would like to take that on? Joe, would you like to take that on?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what our foreign policy is at the moment, whether we have one. Perhaps we do, but maybe I could tell a little anecdote. One of my last tasks before I retired was working, in fact, on a foreign policy, and we had multiple negotiations back and forth between various departments about what ought to go into that foreign policy, and there were consultations. And after months and months of agony, the previous government decided they didn't want a foreign policy at all, and so we put it all back into the cabinet, and that was that. So I think it is actually important to have some clear objectives to understand where your interests are, where your values lie, and how you plan to pursue those, and how you will find the resources in order to deliver. But I'm not sure that we have any one such document at the moment, although that's not to say that we've not been conducting an active foreign policy in a number of areas. Some success.
So from my perspective in the trenches and in foreign policy research, I mean, we don't have a foreign policy document per se, but we do have some very clear guiding principles, and we have long-term interests that have really not changed substantively over time. So, we've got the Feminist International Assistance Policy, we've got, our trade policies and so on. And so, really, from the point of view of a worker, I think we have clear marching orders, but we don't have what a lot of us would like to see, that document that we could hand out and say, okay, these are Canada's 5 clear guiding principles based on these shared values, and this is our mission in the world. And I think in some ways that is a piece of what I kind of would have liked to have seen in the Security Council campaign. I feel like we're asking people to support us, countries to support us, and to a large extent, a Security Council campaign is a ground game. Also, in getting individuals, ministers, or ambassadors, permanent representatives in New York to say, we're supporting Canada rather than somebody else. And without that, those very clear points, it makes it hard.
Mark, did you want to?
I think it is very important to have a foreign policy, because the prosperity of this country depends on our integration with the world. We are economically interdependent and more interdependent with the entire world. Therefore, you need to reflect and to ensure that you engage your citizens, your civil society, your stakeholders, your academic in reflecting about foreign issues. Sometimes it is esoteric. I am disappointed, saddened, I would say, that we don't have, that the Prime Minister said no to a monk debate. It would have been an occasion to raise the profile of the importance of foreign issues with Canadians. Because something happened, and we know, we look at China or United States, you know, I mean, a year ago we didn't know what was going to happen in our relationship with the United States. Well, you know, the prosperity of this province, the event depends on a fluid relationship with the United States. And not only this province, but the entire country. Therefore, the connection between world affairs, integration, economic interdependence and integrations, globalism. Trump said yesterday that he's against globalists. This is the most stupid thing I've heard, you know, especially in the context of the United Nations. So why is that? Why? Because the prosperity of the United States depends on economic integration in the world. And therefore, you know, we have this guy denouncing it. Well, we should not remain silent on it, and we should say foreign policy is important. Now, foreign policy is not an esoteric policy like, you know, somewhere. You have to ensure that you coordinate your aid policy, your military approach, your human rights policy, and your immigration policy. And you know what? If we win this seat at the United Nations, it will be because of our immigration policy. The only country in the world with open arms, welcoming 300,000 new immigrants year in, year out, is us. And if I would be the ambassador in New York, I would call on every single ambassadors and say, who could match that? No one.
Thank you, Mark. And we have a question at the back. Just while the microphone makes its way to you, speaking on the issue of foreign policy, and Gary, to your question, in 2017, we launched our new defense policy, Strong, Secure, Engaged, at about 135 pages long, far exceeding anything that had happened in the last 10 years in terms of the number of pages. But Minister Freeland had to get up in the House of Commons the day before and deliver a very powerful foreign policy speech, because I had the sense myself that some people might have thought defense policy was leading foreign policy. Just to reflect on your question.
There was mention of, there was a lot of talk about the UN Security Council, and one thing I've often thought, though, is with the Security Council, how these 5 superpowers have veto power on policies. It's like, well, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So what I've often thought and talked to many of my friends and school teachers about is, would it be best if the Security Council was we just got rid of the Security Council, like every country, one vote, and no country has veto power over the other.
And who would like to handle that question?
Well, you know, it's a good question. I mean, it is indeed a very good question, but you have to look from an historical perspective. Therefore, when you address, if you want what to do, you want to get rid of it, you have to go back to the League of Nations. And you go back to the League of Nations, and suddenly the League of Nations was very weak because it was one country, one vote, and no executive committee looking at it. Therefore, it led, not because of the League of Nations, but the League of Nations was not able to prevent the Second World War. They were not able to prevent the invasion of Ethiopia by Italy in 1936. They were not able to prevent the Spanish War, Civil War, or get involved in it. Therefore, the powers that be, after the Second World War, said, we need an executive body. We need an executive body that is representative, and that is the main mission of that executive body, is to ensure peace and security.
So pretty much to ensure that there is a body to make the final decision to prevent indecisiveness.
Yeah. And then, and indecisiveness and even chaos. You know, I mean, if not, you are 193 and then everybody has a right to do something, and it's a total chaos. You have to bring some order to it. But your question is very relevant because nations are struggling to reform the Security Council. Should the veto powers persist? Should we have more permanent members or less? Should everybody be invited to compete for a seat? But even between the 20, the 15 members, nobody agrees. And the reason nobody agrees on it is that the people with the veto power said, I'm not going to lose my veto power. And you have to work at it. You have to bring ideas. You have to reflect, to analyze, to try to find the right moment to change the governance. The decline of institutions in the world is because the governance is not adequate to respond to the world challenges. And therefore you reflect on that. Work on the governance of the UN Security Council will be a tremendous contribution.
Jill, would you like to, or Patrick?
I don't think I have anything to add, actually, but I think another question would be welcome.
I'll come back up here. I've got a question down here. So.
Good evening. Full disclosure, I'm a public international lawyer and the dean of the law school here. And I've reflected a little bit of false modesty in all of your presentations with respect. Because it's my view, and I'm so disappointed, that this is the time for Canada to take a leading role. Think about the International Criminal Court. Think about the Climate Change Convention. Think about the responsibility to protect. Canada has been instrumental in developing the international rule of law for 70 years. And the point is, what I'm so disappointed, I lived in the UK for the last 16 years, in coming back is that we don't seem to recognize that there is a major leadership gap in the international community. We've got Europe tearing itself apart with the Brits. We've got America in free fall. This is a good time for Christy Freeland and Trudeau, if he gets re-elected, to say, wait a minute here. deal with problems of UN governance, deal with problems of human rights. And by the way, I totally agree with you, Patrick, there is a genocide going on in both of those situations that you've discussed, not to mention Syria and the Yazidi people. There have been genocides we haven't even responded to. It's shocking. And yet we were instrumental in developing those international rules of law, and yet we're not taking our leadership position. And I was just wondering if you have any suggestions as to how the rest of us might possibly pressure our government to take their role in leading what is a crisis in the international community. Thank you.
Isn't there a public opportunity for that sometime in October?
But who do I vote?
Jill, would you like to weigh in?
Well, I agree that I think there is a tremendous opportunity for Canada to play a role, given some of the crisis in governance really that we see all around the world. But I also, if I look at the current federal election campaign, I heard scarcely a word about anything to do with foreign or defense policy. And I think unless there is a clear indication from civil society at large that foreign policy is a priority and something they want governments to pay attention to. I'm not saying that it's not important for this government, but I think it will never be at the top of the agenda. I also think that governments, not just the Canadian government, are increasingly risk averse, and people are afraid of embarking on an issue that is complicated, that is potential for offending other partners, and is likely to soak up significant amounts of resources. So I think those are some of the factors that are mitigating against a creative foreign policy, but I do agree that there is a moment where there are opportunities, not least because I think eventually that the tide will turn against some of the authoritarian governments or tendencies toward authoritarian government that we've seen, and then there will be opportunity for countries like Canada to make a mark.
I just want to thank the panel and Chris for sharing their years of knowledge and experience on the subject, so thank you very much. My question relates to the relationship between diplomats, professional diplomats, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or politicians in general, actually. I've heard several ex-diplomats speak over the last 18 months or so, and several of them, the sort of feeling I take back actually after those talks, listening to those talks, rightly or wrongly, is that there might be some disconnects actually, or that Foreign Affairs Canada or the minister may not necessarily always heed the advice from the troops on the ground actually, i.e. the diplomats. Is that feeling right, wrong, comments appreciated?
Jill, would you like to start off, because you were just recently in Moscow?
Well, maybe sort of take a bit more of a broader historical perspective on this, and I think that the role of the public servant and the role of the politician are very different. And the role of a public servant or a diplomat is to provide the best possible advice based on the information that they have available to ministers. Ministers then have to take that into consideration, weigh it against their own political imperatives, and bring that political lens to decision making. And I think, you know, in a perfect world, there is that kind of creative tension between the political level and the public service. That's as it should be. Sometimes it tilts a little bit in one direction or the other, and sometimes those relationships become more fraught than they sometimes ought to be. And I don't think I'm close enough to it today to say whether, I've certainly seen relationships between the public service and the political level in a much worse state than they are today. And I think if you hear about frictions, that's not abnormal. But I don't think I'm close enough to it to comment on a thing like that. But Mark, you have a long history.
I've been gone for a long time. But let me make two comments. It may have happened, and I would say that the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the last 12 to 14 months was totally absorbed by the relationship with the United States. How to properly manage that relationship, embark in the negotiations, and so on and so forth, and that was our prime responsibility. Therefore, all the other files at the ministerial level were set aside or, to be discussed down the line. Therefore, this disconnect may have happened. But I have to tell you that as a former ambassador, having served in three various, and I see a lot of my colleagues here in the audience, and for the students who may have an opportunity to see them, you have a lot of diplomatic experience in this room. Every single time I receive a minister, a prime minister, a governor general, but the political level, when I was in the field, they were captive, they were attentive, they were paying attention, they were interested, they were reading and wanted and seeking your advice. Therefore, the relationship in the field, between the political level and the Canadian Foreign Service has always been, in my experience of 40 years, impeccable. In Ottawa, it is different. It is different because there is a lack of trust. Lack of trust. Trust is very important in our world, but trust in government relationship and governance is very important. It's a key component, trust. The political level arrived without having the full trust towards the public service, be it the foreign service or the immigration guys or something. They did not have the trust. And the foreign service suffered a lot by this lack of trust, by this absence of confidence that existed. And under other governments. But if you read the memoirs of former prime ministers will always praise the Canadian public service. And when I see the appointments of political appointees left and right in a more senior diplomatic job, we do that at our perils. Because the younger generation that should enter the foreign service or the public service of Canada, when they see that, they decide to go another route. And the experience will never be built. And that's where I think that in terms of governance, we need to reassess how we do things.
Thank you, Mark. We have time for one more question.
My name is Rick Lotto, and full disclosure, I had 35 years in foreign service, serving all over the place. Now, the nitty-gritty, we've all been discussing very interesting and useful topics. But the main point, from a nitty-gritty basis, is the recruitment. I was really shocked to hear that there has been no input in the past 7 years. Am I right in that?
Well, not quite no input, but very, very much lower than there was, you know, in normal years. I think the last recruitment they hired, I think it was about 50 people, and initially they were hired as terms, which was something that was unheard of before. Yeah, they were on 2-year contracts with no guarantee of being kept on. And we did manage, I mean, over that period of time, I mean, PASO advocated with the department. The department also wanted, I mean, they were concerned about budgets basically and making commitments to people for indeterminate contracts that they wouldn't be able to keep. So it wasn't like they didn't want to keep people, but they were, you know, they needed to get that sorted out. So all those people have, I think, for the most part, been hired now, and they're permanent. But you know, it left a huge gap, and a number of people decided not to stay or decided not to accept the offers. You know, people were supposed to have been hired on a non-imperative basis for language, so they, you know, would have gotten training, and they got to a certain point in the selection process and were told, oh, by the way, we're now testing your language levels, and if you're not already bilingual, forget it. You know, we're not hiring you. So the good news is that I understand from the personnel that they will soon be doing a recruitment, a national recruitment through the public service recruitment mechanism. And we haven't heard for sure that it will be non-imperative, but we're hearing good noises that they've listened to us, you know, in our point that you need to have a representative foreign service across the country, and that if you require that from the beginning, that you're really, you know, leaving out large hunks of the eligible pool. So we're a little optimistic on that.
That is promising news. But full disclosure, I did teach the international in the business faculty international business a few years ago, and I saw so many promising candidates, and there are lots here as well. And we have to encourage these people. Too, AFSO, I guess, is doing a very good job.
Thank you.
One of the horrible jobs of being a moderator is calling an event to a close. Before we let you go, there are always lots of people behind the scenes that make an event like this work. First, it starts with Phil and the retired heads of Mission Association here that did the hard work to bring the panel together. We have the support from the Center for Global Studies, who arranged the room and the filming. We have our own CIC crew, who also happen to be undergraduates of political studies crew as well, who managed to get the food here. This is the worst job. I wouldn't want to do this job. I would mess it up. I got the drinks here, live streaming the event, I think. Yes, we did manage to do that. I mean, it's what makes an activity like this actually work. We heard tonight, of course, old school diplomacy is still important. It actually should be not old school. It's what's required. And here in Victoria, of course, we have the Canadian International Council. And it's getting bigger every day. And networks are really important. And I'm really pleased to tell you that 17 students joined CIC today. And that puts us well over 100 students now in our organization. And it's bringing panelists together with this expertise, with younger people, that it's going to make the change that we've all been talking about tonight that we want to see in the future. So on behalf of all of us here, I'd like to thank our panelists very much for such a great evening. And thank you very much for coming this evening. Or if you want to hear more about CIC, please come and see me. But most important of all, students, there's pizza left over.